The Oppression of the Modern World. Speech delivered on November 25, 1938 before the Laureano Conservative Convention. Laureano Gómez. Translated by Narco-Republican.
At the beginning of one of his books, Jacques Maritain, noted among the highest contemporary thinkers, says that intelligence, under the threat of a degraded civilization which delivers man to the indefinite of matter, reacts in the sense of defense, to vindicate its right and its essential superiority. But it itself brought about the evil from which it now defends itself from, because it wanted to limit all knowledge within the boundaries of reason itself. First belittled and dismissed the transcendental truths, then angrily repudiated and finally denied them. This has generated an absolute disorder in the mental outlook of modern man. The rationalist movement wanted to demonstrate the possibility of the reign of reason over nature, with total oblivion of the dominance of the supernatural over reason, and this upheaval of traditional values has been fatal for the same intelligence that drowns in the sea of an incomprehensible and incoercible matter, jealous of the establishment of the empire of that independent reason. Thus it multiplies and aggravates to the utmost the enigmas of its essence and its existence, and demonstrates that this was nothing but a daring and vacuous enterprise of fatuity. Human reason, left to the fullness of its peculiar development and followed by all the radii of the sphere where it wanted or could project its desire for wisdom or its anguish to acquire some certainty, came in the ancient age to build in the manner of an anthropocentric vault, where all episodes of life arose, developed to later be extinguished and then be repeated without end, with monotonous rhythm. Seen from the center of the sphere, it formed an ingenious machinery, a complicated construction not exempt of harmony, a radial architecture that entertained and enraptured whoever could see it from its tiny center, as base, origin, principle and driving force of the surrounding universe. There were no transcendental horizons. All ideological perspectives were constituted by closed curves whose inflection on the starting point made any escape towards the transcendent impossible. The intellectual firmament bore a close resemblance to the natural one perceived by the rudimentary senses, a blue roofing, plenty of sun, adorned with fantastic clouds, or a marvelous star-coffered ceiling, placed so far and so high for the amusement and delight of the inhabitants of the earth. But there came a time, when the construction of pagan wisdom showed signs of decrepitude, because its system was flawed, incoherent, incapable of solving the enigmas of daily experience, in which the celestial vault, kept in its hermetic context by the imaginative and philosophical limitation of man, widened and unfolded, first opening up and then tearing itself apart to pieces, leaving nothing of its old appearance, in the fashion of how the enormous structure of an aerostat which devoured by flames disappears, leaving behind nothing but smoke and fragile, burnt and twisted beams. The appearance of Christianity on earth took man out of the whirlpool of the natural physical world, broke the exhausting rotation around hollow and shifting principles before the thrust of the great purifying wind that, broken the envelope, invaded the previously closed and immobile space and scattered the dust and ashes of that great intellectual catastrophe. The natural reason in the descending spirals of his reasoning had concluded by oppressing the human spirit like the grapes under the press lowered by an implacable screw. The struggle of the instincts, the sagacities of intelligence placed at their service with no other norm than visible and near success, nor any other limitation than that tolerated by desire, in the moral universe engendered an unjust ethic that led to the table of the feast of life a few while leaving innumerable and desperate multitudes crying their hunger and helplessness on the threshold of the palaces. And in the political world created a varied mosaic of systems to govern society, whether for the benefit of one, or of few, or of a caste, a tribe, a privileged multitude. The simple despotism, the tyranny of the archons, the aristocratic predominance, the domination of the caste, the diverse forms of demagogy and ochlocracy were so many other infinite trials of the intelligence of man who did not know how to balance the values of the complicated game of existence, lacking the knowledge of entity, essence and transcendence of the two supreme values of civil life, the liberty and the dignity of the human person. In the ancient world men were not free. Slavery appeared as an imposition of nature, a consubstantial, logical, licit necessity, genuinely detached from the phenomenon of the population on earth. The wonderful concept of liberty was totally unknown. Glimpses of its admirable light would appear sometimes in the Hellenic and the primitive Roman republics. But the true spirit of liberty did not exist in them. The Greeks separated their own world from that of the barbarians, in which none of the formulas of their political equity deserved to be applied, and in their own country liberty could not usefully exist except for some, as can be seen in Aristotle. Nor were the Roman criterion for weighting and jurisprudence devised for the general benefit in which barbarians participated, neither in the austere early days, nor in the later times of the empire's greatness and decadence. A criterion that would now be called racist dominated civil conceptions. As a necessary consequence, the dignity of the human person as an independent value, acting on its own, fundamental, organic, inspirer of institutions and customs, was also unknown. There was no one dignified but the despot, the king, the emperor, the tyrant. Or they were none but the aristocrats, the members of the caste, the men of the privileged tribe, the inhabitants of the dominating city, or the plebs of the oppressive towns. All other men were heads of cattle born to obey and suffer. That crowd had no rights nor prerogatives nor dignity. That was the laborious construction of the ancient city that disappeared when the message of Christ, the good news, brought to the juridical heritage of humanity the two unknown values, the liberty and the dignity of the person. As centuries later all of Ptolemy's so-called geocentric science was unable to withstand the onslaught of Copernicus' arguments and demonstrations, and of the sun, the moon and the stars that revolved around the earth, and of the immense blue celestial vault that rested on the confines of the terrestrial plane, nothing remained, nor did anything useful remain from that hermetic, anthropocentric machinery, which knew not how to give men but formulas of tyranny and inequality. That was the most authentic movement of liberation recorded in human history, which advanced slowly amidst unprecedented efforts and sacrifices of the utmost heroism, through the imperial gardens decorated with living torches, through the arenas of the circuses, among the wild beasts, on the terraces of the praetoriums, or in the impenetrable darkness of sheltering and consoling catacombs. Those were 300 years of tireless struggle, of persecutions, of martyrdom and sanctity, until the Edict of Milan put human strength at the service of the unknown principles and began in the history of man a new culture that remains to this day and for whose sacred defense we are gathered here. For nothing is of such value for the liberty of the souls as having been able to counterpose to the pagan city, which claimed to be everything to man and absorbed the spiritual power into the temporal, the Christian idea of the distinction between the two powers which henceforth could no longer be mixed or confused. The despotism that claims to dominate the same over souls as over bodies, was deprived of meaning and exposed in the fullness of its affront from the day that Christ, taking the denarius in his divine hand, asked whose was the effigy engraved therein and divided the patrimony of life between Caesar and God. The martyr, refusing to sacrifice to the idols, even though the proconsul exhibited the imperial mandate, did nothing else than vindicate the liberty of the souls, repudiate the divinization of the state, stand up audacious against the totalitarian regime that, even if it did not bear that name then, was identical in essence to that which now oppresses a large part of humanity. When children study the heroic times of primitive Christianity in history, they can imagine that those distant events sank into the mists of antiquity, never to be repeated in contemporary life. Today there is the same abuse and it cannot be combated except by similar procedures. But it's already known who will be the victor. Nor did ancient culture knew how to discover the prodigious value of the dignity of the human person. There were the worthy, privileged individuals, dressed in the honorific chlamys, standing out from the dark mass of the miserable, the unworthy, those who don't even deserve pity. But when it was said that all were children of God and that the gates of the divine kingdom are open to those who deserve to enter, without distinction between the powerful and the unfortunate, into the thoughts of men a radically different species, different from those existing, was introduced, which brought down all the foundations, the pretexts, the sophisms that sustained inequality. Those who were equal before God could not be unequal before men, and from that unprecedented revelation arose the concept of the human person as something real, independent, positive and eternal, a most firm foundation on which the balanced, strong and harmonious construction of a new juridical order arose. From the Edict of Milan to the outbreak of the French Revolution, that era of liberty and dignity of the person, preserved in the teaching of Christ against the lurks and machinations of the ever-awake tyranny, was able to direct the course of history for 15 centuries. But then came the rationalist squall with the attempt to erase the doctrine of the gospel from the human conscience, and a century and a half has been enough for the universe to be waterlogged in the deluge of errors, which were once vanquished, but have returned to raise their heads haughtily and oppress the modern world with diabolical efficacy. Those were not, in truth, 15 centuries of quietude and prosperity, because humanity, according to the sense of St. Paul, has always been sought after by two extremes, a pure subhuman materialism and a superhuman divine life. Materialism invaded, and sometimes dominated, the Christian orb, as, among many others, the heartbreaking lamentations of Hildebrand testify. The arrogance of reason fought tirelessly to banish from wisdom any transcendent concept, seeking ways to suffice itself and always causing an outrageous confusion because it is the law of history and of life that there is no order and peace in the human being but when sense is subjected to reason and reason to God. The disruption of this law, which is derived from the profound and immutable nature of things, engendered the calamities and abuses recorded in the history of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but the Christian idea always occupied the apex, and after the successive eclipses the divine light of liberty and dignity shone again. In its satanic struggle, reason erects a doctrine according to which everything must be examined, at all times and by anyone, without ever deciding, and with such a paralyzing and sterilizing theory, Protestantism tried to stop the efficacy of the liberating work of Christ and made the clumsy attempt to deliver back into the hands of secular princes the sword of spiritual power. The failure of Protestantism, which claimed the freedom of examination and led to the ominous slavery of life, did not hold back the efforts of independent reason. As daughter of the Reform appeared the Revolution, which was a step further, the determined attempt to exclude all Christian influence over life, the proclamation of the bankruptcy of Christianity, the gigantic undertaking, the decisive experiment to preserve dignity and to guarantee it in a sphere independent and foreign to the influence of Christ. But the Revolution failed to realize its purposes. It made the declaration of the rights of man to violate them in disproportionate magnitude with the blade of the guillotine. The Revolution was a failure because it did not know how, it did not manage to give humanity a single-day sample of that disaffected freedom and that atheist dignity boastfully announced in its subversive proclamations. The Revolution brought tyranny and the debasement of man. The century and a half that has passed since then is a nightmare for mankind. Men are maddened because they no longer know their origin, nor what should be the rhythm of their living, nor the path of their destiny. They are placed within the phenomenon of existence, and if they have any spiritual concerns, if they deviate from the rudimentary category of dung-producing animals, they would like to know why they are there, who brought them, if the beating of their heart and the pondering of their intelligence mean anything. If all the reality that the testimony of his conscience discovers has value and matters for anything other than to be extinguished in nothingness without return, without consequence, without object. The disastrous contemporary times are dominated by that goddess reason that one day wanted to be worshipped instead of Christ under the banners of Our Lady. The men of the Revolution continuously interpose her to prevent the multitude from contemplating the divine figure of Christ. And the multitude don't see it. But deprived of the consoling light with which she illuminated the arcane, the pretended goddess offers no answer to any of the decisive questions that men must ask themselves after each of their contacts with reality. What for the Christian is the marvelous fact of life and death, becomes for the anti-Christian a stupid phenomenon, without cause, without logic, without explanation, which engenders in the depths of the hearts an inextinguishable resentment. That is why today's humanity is victim of horrifying nightmare. No effort is needed to relate the present political disorder in Colombia with the terrifying picture that the entire earth offers. We cannot claim that our country is an islet of tranquility and prosperity in the midst of the tempestuous sea, nor that it is reserved for our use a slit of blue, clear and serene sky among the somber clouds that envelop the earth. For the Conservative Party has seen with luminous precision the seriousness of the hour. It has risen in all the imposing majesty of its stature to come forward to the great struggle against the powers of hell. That is why the children of this land, like no others, lovers of the best traditions of the homeland culture, like few others addicted to precise terms, clear ideas and definite attitudes, singular in their adherence to Catholic belief and their profound conservative convictions, are gathered here with unspeakable enthusiasm to choose and prepare the wisest forms of intervention in the life of the Republic. Such a pure and noble faith, such abnegation and detachment, such a courageous resolution to fight to the death for the most generous ideal that the human mind can conceive are omen of splendid victory. Conservatives of Narino, I announce that you are going to conquer in the coming months the laurels of an immortal victory.